So there is a pretty decent chance that the popular app known as TikTok is going to be banned within the next few days, in the United States, of course. And also, of course, I do have a presence on that app. I have made a plethora of dinosaur-related videos, most of which will probably be gone forever because I don't really have the necessary storage to save them all. So to combat that, I just want to compile a little bit of a compilation of some of my TikToks that were just talking about dinosaurs. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much what this is. So, you know, just kind of like sit back, relax, and just listen to some random dinosaur information.
Yeah, no, there are some awesome Australian dinosaurs. There are always two that come into mind that are some of my absolute favorites. The first being Australovenator or Australovenator. These guys were likely one of the top predators of their given environment at their given time. And what's especially cool about them is that they belong to a family of dinosaurs known as the Megaraptorids. Megaraptors are very insanely awesome dinosaurs, mainly because they're just so creepy with their overall just look to them. They generally had like an arrow-shaped head with a decently slim body and these massive arms. Their arms were so huge that it's incredibly likely that they relied on them primarily for hunting their prey. In fact, with Australovenator in particular, it seems that it had a much wider range of motion in its wrists than most other theropods did. So it seems incredibly likely that these guys were just, they grab onto their prey more than anything, which is awesome. And another dinosaur that I always think about because it's one of my all-time favorite dinosaurs ever is Muttaburrasaurus. Now this works out because I've been getting some requests to talk about this dinosaur. It was this really cool herbivorous dinosaur that was primarily bipedal, but was able to switch to quadrupedal locomotion when it was eating or getting a drink or something like that. The thing that stands out the most about them is that huge nose. Judging from the skull, they kind of have like an enlarged nasal area, and it seems likely that the places with blanks would have been covered in soft tissue and possibly looked very strange on the animal. Now, there is reason to believe that it's possible that this type of nasal structure they had going on would help amplify their noises, which means that the environment was probably pretty loud when these guys were around. But these two are just absolutely awesome dinosaurs, and they're always really fun to bring up. Here's some awesome information about one of the strangest dinosaur families out there, the Therizinosaurs. Therizinosaurs are very unique dinosaurs, but where I like to usually start when I'm talking about them is the initial discovery of Therizinosaurus. When it was discovered, it was initially described as, wait for it, a giant turtle. It was mainly described off of those huge claws. But of course, you know how the story goes, eventually we find more fossil material and a lot more analysis is able to be done on these type of animals, and we later learn that they were not a giant turtle. In fact, they were just a strange theropod dinosaur. And strange is kind of putting it lightly. They were likely herbivorous animals, but they had that kind of contrast with those massive claws. In fact, Therizinosaurus itself has the largest claws of any dinosaur that we currently know of. It's likely that those claws would have been used to pull down branches and kind of help just tear up vegetation, making it easier for the animal to eat. Along with that, a lot of the Therizinosaurs had a very kind of massive build, with most likely some feathers and a pretty small head with a beak at the front of the mouth. There's even one Therizinosaur that we know part of the coloration of. That little fella is known as Baryonyx. These guys were relatively small for a Therizinosaur, but are of course extremely important. Now, first of all, they confirmed that at least some Therizinosaurs did have feathers. In fact, it's likely that all of them did. But the feathers were also preserved well enough that we can see the melanosomes, which of course help us determine what color this animal was in life. And at least part of some individuals would have been this kind of brown coloration. And I always love bringing that up because the fact that we can determine some dinosaurs' colors is just such a cool thing to me. Plateosaurus is coming to Prehistoric Kingdom, so to celebrate, I figured we could talk about Plateosaurus. Now, Plateosaurus, or Plateosaurus, is a basal sauropodomorph that lived in the late Triassic of what is now Europe. These guys are incredibly interesting, them and other early sauropodomorphs. Of course, these type of dinosaurs are the ones that saw the rise of the huge sauropods that we're so used to seeing that hailed in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous periods. Of course, you're probably looking at them and saying, those are incredibly different to those later sauropods. And of course, you're absolutely right. Earlier on in the Triassic, dinosaurs had a tendency to be completely bipedal, and that was true for the early sauropodomorphs. Plateosaurus here was an obligate biped, which means that it had no choice but to walk on its hind legs. Those front limbs were not suited to be walked on, essentially. They were more like hands. They had claws that were perfect for grasping vegetation and also could have been used for defense. But much like the later sauropods, they did have a long neck and a relatively small head that had teeth and jaws that were, of course, suited for vegetation. I really think that the Prehistoric Kingdom design for these guys is incredibly awesome, and I really can't wait for this animal to be added to the game. This is Ichthyovenator. Ichthyovenator was a spinosaurid that lived during the early Cretaceous in what is now Asia. Being a spinosaurid meant that they would have had the adaptations for a piscivorous lifestyle because, of course, spinosaurids were fish eaters. They had straight and conical teeth, something that were perfect for catching slippery fish, and likely would have had an elongated snout with a notch in that snout. Other things that make it easy to catch fish. They also most likely had huge and powerful arms, something that is very common in spinosaurids. But where Ichthyovenator gets really interesting is with its sail. Now, much like Spinosaurus or Suchomimus, they did have tall, narrow spines, but they were not nearly as long as something like Spinosaurus's. They were quite short on the animal's back, and where it gets extremely interesting, at least in my own opinion, is that they kind of have two separate sails, essentially. They have the one on the back that kind of dips down at the hip, and then a second one kind of begins above the leg and continues on there for a little bit. It makes for a very interesting silhouette and a very fascinating looking dinosaur. Just another example of how diverse and strange this family of dinosaurs could be. This is Diplodocus, or as it's sometimes pronounced,
Diplodocus.
I am a father. But Diplodocus is a dinosaur that was discovered all the way back in 1877. For some perspective, that is a whole century before the release of Star Wars. So it's a dinosaur that we've known about for a very long time. It was of course a sauropod dinosaur, one of the long-necked dinosaurs. It lived during the late Jurassic of what is now North America. Because we've known them so long, they've gone through a lot of different iterations as we've learned more about them. There was even a certain point in time where many believed that they had sort of a sprawled stance similar to that of lizards. Of course, we now know that the skeletal structure certainly wouldn't support something like that. Nowadays, we know the animal was quite different from that whole depiction. It was among the longest of the sauropod dinosaurs, with a length that could reach up to 26 meters or 85 feet, and a staggering 25% of that length comes from its neck. Its neck, of course, was incredibly beneficial for this animal, being able to reach all kinds of different vegetation without even having to move the rest of its body. They also possessed a very long, thin, flexible tail that would probably move around quite a bit when the animal was moving. And something else that I think is really cool about them is that we found out after analysis of their hips that they likely would have been able to stand on their hind legs for a short period of time, while the tail would touch the ground and formed sort of a tripod pose. They are certainly very fascinating animals, and again, ones that we've known about for a very long time, so they're one of the original dinosaurs, if you will, but they're really cool. Dilophosaurus, one of my favorite dinosaurs. Dilophosaurus was a theropod dinosaur that lived in the early Jurassic of what is now North America, and they were big. They were very big. It's estimated that they had a length of around 7 meters or 23 feet and a weight of around 400 kilograms or 880 pounds. This makes them among the earliest of the large theropod dinosaurs, as well as, at the very least, the largest theropod dinosaur of North America at the time. They also have very cool attributes about them. They have this huge, long, slender body with these decently large forelimbs that actually had 4 fingers instead of the typical 3 that you would see in a lot of theropod dinosaurs, although the 4th digit was vestigial, which means that it didn't have much use to it. They had a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth, and the most notable thing are, of course, those awesome-looking crests on their head. Now, we don't actually know how big those crests could have gotten, because the available fossil material is, of course, incomplete. But considering the fact that these are just a small portion of the crests, and the actual crests would have also been layered in keratin in life, it seems reasonable that these structures would have been pretty massive on the animals in life. And of course, could have been used as a form of display. So they could have been brightly colored or something like that. It would have been really cool. There's also a possibility that these guys had some form of feathering. There is possible fossil evidence of something like that. The evidence in question is a trace fossil of a theropod dinosaur that was about the same size as Dilophosaurus, kind of sitting down and leaving behind some feather imprints. So it certainly is possible that Dilophosaurus did have feathers in life. And I might as well add that they, of course, were not venomous in life. Aside from Triceratops, Styracosaurus has to be one of the most popular ceratopsian dinosaurs out there. I mean, seriously, this thing has shown up in a lot of different media over the years, and that's for very good reason. It has a really interesting silhouette about it. Now, of course, it had the pretty typical ceratopsian build, but where it really stands out, like with most ceratopsians, is with that head. It did have a typical ceratopsian beak, as well as a huge nasal horn, and the really awesome frill spikes that are just also massive in appearance. Now, what I think is most notable about these frill spikes is that they're one of the few examples that we have of individual variation in non-avian dinosaurs. See, because the number of spikes situated on top of the frill would vary from individual to individual. Probably my favorite example of this, and the example that really kind of let us know that this is something that was present on this dinosaur, is with the specimen nicknamed Hannah. Hannah actually has asymmetrical spikes. She has a different number of spikes on her right side compared to her left side. And that is just really cool if you ask me. Now, I've just said it before and I'll continue to say it many times, but ceratopsians are truly amazing dinosaurs. As it currently stands, Tyrannosaurus rex is the largest carnivorous dinosaur to ever live. It was incredibly bulky, had insane eyesight, a great sense of smell, and the most powerful bite force of any land animal to ever exist, as far as we know. But when looking at those adaptations, the question might arise, why did those adaptations exist in the first place? Well, when you look at the herbivores that existed at the same time in the Hell Creek Formation, then it becomes pretty clear. Tyrannosaurus rex lived alongside some absolutely heavy hitters of animals. And they were definitely not pushovers. You had Ankylosaurus. Ankylosaurus was covered in a sort of natural armor. These are the bones that grow in the skin known as osteoderms. And while Tyrannosaurus rex could probably get through those because, you know, they're bones and Tyrannosaurus rex's bite is designed for bone crushing, it'd be harder to justify getting close when you see that club, because that club was perfect for smashing the bones of your would-be attacker. There was also the absolutely massive Edmontosaurus. In fact, Edmontosaurus annectens was likely the largest animal in the Hell Creek Formation. Yes, larger than Tyrannosaurus rex. And I know that they're always portrayed as kind of cannon fodder for Tyrannosaurus rex in most media, but chances are when push comes to shove and they're trying to save their own life and, you know, live to fight another day, chances are they'll probably give T-Rex a hard time. And of course, there's one of the most iconic dinosaurs to ever live, Triceratops. Triceratops translates to three-horned face, named as such because it has three horns on its face. Those three horns were certainly a force to be reckoned with. I mean, the nasal horn was significantly reduced, but the brow horns were absolutely massive and incredibly impressive. Get too close to something like that and chances are you won't be in for a good time. On top of that, there is the Triceratops frill. Now, Triceratops has an interesting frill because most ceratopsians actually have holes in their frill. These are known as fenestra. Triceratops lack those holes, so it seems likely that the frill of Triceratops prioritized defense more so than display. I mean, it was likely used for both, but defense was probably a big factor. Also, if you want to go a little bit more south in the United States, Tyrannosaurus rex did live alongside Alamosaurus in some areas, which is the last known sauropod dinosaur of North America. Chances are T-Rex wouldn't hunt the largest individuals, but it could have possibly gone off after some younger individuals. I mean, that's always sort of a possibility. Either way, I'm sure that they still would have given them a hard time. So the moral of the story is, T-Rex probably had a pretty difficult life. Do you guys remember this sound? Of course, a few months ago, this sound was making the rounds on the internet as the real T-Rex sound, like what T-Rex truly sounded like. I talked about it a little bit then, but there was a lot of things that I didn't cover that I really wish I had at the time, especially considering the fact that I wanted to at the time. So we're going to cover it now. So again, what that audio set out to do was to show you what Tyrannosaurus rex truly sounded like and how much it differed from something like the Jurassic Park version. But the problem with that is that this wasn't actually a study. This wasn't a study done on Tyrannosaurus vocalization, and it wasn't actually published. It wasn't truly confirmed vocalizations of Tyrannosaurus rex. It was basically just its own edited sounds that were made to sound like a bigger creature or something along those lines. Because we don't actually have a sound to place with Tyrannosaurus rex. Of course, we can go off of what's most likely for something like Tyrannosaurus rex, like how I mentioned in a previous video. We know that mammalian roars are not likely for dinosaurs, but something like rat-type booms or crocodile grumbles, those are certainly a lot more likely for dinosaurs. But that's about it. We don't have actual sounds to place with them. All we can really do is speculate what those sounds could possibly sound like. And the problem with videos like that, or audios like that rather, is that they presented themselves as this is actually what they sounded like. And that's what everybody ran with. There were a lot of people making videos about how terrifying it truly sounded. And this isn't even the first time this happened. I remember, I think a couple years ago, the same thing happened with my favorite dinosaur, Spinosaurus. I'm sure that you remember this sound.
That sound certainly did make the rounds, and what it basically is just a slowed down loon call. That, or just kind of just edited loon call to make it sound like it's coming from a bigger animal. The same thing applies to Spinosaurus as what I just said with T.rex. We don't actually have any vocalization to place with Spinosaurus. We can really just speculate what they possibly sounded like and go off of what's most likely. But again, you can't just make noises like that and say that that's exactly what it sounded like, because we just don't know. I think I'm saying that too much. Now, I will say that the T.rex vocalization in that audio is technically more likely, because it does seem to take a lot more influence from the really strange noises that ratites can make. But that's pretty much as far as it goes. We can't actually say if this is 100% actually what it sounded like. There's really only one dinosaur that we have a good idea of what it sounded like, and that is Parasaurolophus. And I talked about that a few videos ago, so if you want to check that out, and go ahead. The thumbnail looks like this. So if you just see any of those videos that say this is what dinosaurs truly sounded like, unless it's like footage of modern day birds and their vocalization, then it's not really based in any scientific accuracy or anything like that. So to reiterate, we have a lot of ideas based off of what's likely for dinosaurs and their type of vocalization, but we don't really have any actual sounds to place with those. Why did some theropod dinosaurs have such short arms? I've been getting this question a decent amount recently, so I figured I'd make a video about it. And the answer is probably pretty simple. They likely didn't really need their arms. See, a lot of the theropods that we see that have relatively short arms in comparison to their body size typically have very impressive skulls. Specifically, their bites were pretty impressive. T.rex, for example, had the most powerful bite force of any terrestrial animal that we know of. And because of that, it seems likely that it wouldn't really need its arms, because the biting would do all of the work. And if you look at the lineage of tyrannosaurs in general, this seems to be backed up. Early examples of tyrannosaurs, like all the way back in the Jurassic, had relatively long arms and a significantly reduced bite. It seems likely that they would prioritize using their arms over their bite, but as time went on, you see more and more examples of their arms just getting smaller, whereas their bites got a lot more powerful. So, it just seems likely that tyrannosaurs were starting to lose their arms in favor of that incredibly impressive bite. And the same goes for many other theropods that are like that. Like where this comment comes from, there was an image of a Carnotaurus that also had relatively short arms. And the same thing applies. It probably really didn't need its arms because its bite was perfect for just tearing through flesh with those shark-like teeth. And this is further supported when you look at other theropods that actually had relatively long arms, such as the group known as Megaraptora. These guys had decently weak bite forces, but paired with that, they had huge arms and massive clawed hands. The arms also have a wider range of motion. Because of these things, it seems likely that these guys prioritized using their arms while hunting over their bite. So it does seem like there's a correlation when it comes to bite versus hands in theropod dinosaurs. So to wrap it all up, short arms on theropod dinosaurs are really not a detriment to the animal, especially when they're able to make up for it with something else like their bite. I always love talking about these guys. This is known as Ouranosaurus. Ouranosaurus is an iguanodontian ornithopod that lived during the early Cretaceous of what is now Africa. And they are really flippin' cool, mainly due to their awesome anatomical appearance. They had a pretty large body and a decently small head with a toothless beak. They also had pretty short arms and hands that possessed a thumb claw, similar to the thumb claw of their relative, the iguanodon, though iguanodon had a significantly larger thumb claw than Ouranosaurus did. But probably the thing that stands out the most is that sail. Similar to the very famous Spinosaurus, Ouranosaurus did possess a sail that started from the animal's back and went all the way down to its tail, covering most of its body. Much like Spinosaurus, there are quite a few hypotheses as to what exactly the sail was used for when the animal was still alive, ranging all the way from thermal regulation, as in to help the animal control its body temperature, to a sort of display structure, something to help identify members of the same species, or to attract a mate, or just something along those lines, also leading to the possibility that they had some pretty cool colors on them. I say this quite a bit, but these are probably another one of my favorite herbivorous dinosaurs. I just think that they're really cool, and they're probably one that should be shown off a little bit more in media. Who knows? Do you remember Broken Jaw from Dinosaur Revolution? An Allosaurus who injured his jaw at a young age while confronting a sauropod. Well, did you know that he's based off of a real-life Allosaurus specimen? The specimen in question is USNM 2315. Fossil remains of an Allosaurus with notable damage on the jaw.
which is really cool. I love when inspiration is taken from real-life fossil discoveries, though it is of course not without its differences. For example, the allo portrayed in the documentary is a European species of Allosaurus known as A. europaeus, whereas the actual specimen was a North American species known as A. fragilis. The exact cause of the injury might be different as well. Instead of being struck by a sauropod tail, it seems like the real-life animal was simply bit by another Allosaurus, leaving a crazy injury that once healed over left the resulting look of the jaw. And while we're at it, here's an additional fun fact about the specimen. When this jaw was first found during the 1800s, Marsh had initially described it as a brand new genus of theropod, one that he named Labrosaurus feryx. It wasn't until later evaluation that it was found this jaw belonged to the existing genus of Allosaurus. So that's a no to Labrosaurus. Everyone knows about the legendary Triceratops. It's easily one of the most iconic dinosaurs of all time. But did you know that it wasn't alone? Alongside it lived another large ceratopsian with massive horns, known as Torosaurus. Torosaurus is a very fascinating dinosaur. It got to be roughly the same size as Triceratops, but it varied in a few other ways, such as with its frill. The frill on Torosaurus was longer than the one on Triceratops. It also had more of a rectangular shape. The frill also possessed two large holes known as fenestrae. These were adaptations that would make the skull lighter, something that it most definitely needed because as it currently stands, Torosaurus had the largest skull of any land animal, which is a very impressive feat. Now, before some of you ask, no. Torosaurus was not a fully grown Triceratops. I know that idea was proposed many moons ago, and it certainly caught a lot of traction, so much so that we're still seeing the remnants of it today, but it had been disputed for quite some time now. See, while they might look similar, there are still quite a few anatomical differences that separate them. Not to mention, we have found adult Triceratops specimens, and they don't look anything like Torosaurus. And on the flip side, we have found young Torosaurus specimens, and they don't look anything like Triceratops. So this really gives us the opportunity to view Torosaurus as its own separate genus that simply lived alongside Triceratops, and kind of think how interactions and things like that would go from there. Which is awesome, because in my own personal opinion, Torosaurus is one of the most awesome ceratopsians, and it certainly deserves the recognition. I mean, just look at that face. How can you not love that? Amazing, amazing dinosaur. Velociraptor is by far one of the most popular non-avian dinosaurs out there. Ever since its appearance in the Jurassic Park novel and later movie franchise, it easily became a household name. But of course, the real-life animal differed quite a bit to its on-screen appearance. Velociraptor was truly a fascinating animal that definitely deserves its own little creature profile right here. It was a dromaeosaur that lived during the late Cretaceous in what is now Asia. And in the movies, of course, it's portrayed as this massive 6-foot-tall creature. In reality, Velociraptor was only about the same size as a turkey. And of course, the presence of quill knobs on its ulna let us know that this animal was also feathered in life. In reality, Velociraptor would have had a much more bird-like appearance. It also had a pretty narrow and slender skull. It was a really cool looking animal. The most famous thing about it is probably that toe claw. The second toe on each of its feet had this massive toe claw that was raised up that was likely used to help the animal pin down its prey when it was attacking it. And despite the fact that Velociraptor is significantly smaller than what most people think, this still would have done some serious damage, I guarantee it. That along with the claws on its arms and its mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. One cool thing to note about this animal is that we actually have a little bit of an insight of what it hunted. See, there was this specimen right here of a Velociraptor locked in combat with a Protoceratops. This shows a predator-prey relationship. The Velociraptor is seemingly attacking the Protoceratops while the Protoceratops is defending itself. And it seems likely that they were buried in the middle of combat, which means that they were fossilized incredibly quickly, which means that we get this amazing fossil right here. Also goes to show the Velociraptor was definitely no pushover. Truly just awesome animals. So I'm sure that you're at least partially familiar with Oviraptor. Oviraptor has always been hailed as the quintessential egg-eating dinosaur, so much so that its name literally translates to egg thief. And of course, the reason why this is because the first ever specimen that was found of Oviraptor was found on top of some eggs. Now, initially it was assumed that these were Protoceratops eggs, because at the time it was thought that Protoceratops eggs were being found everywhere. So it was a fair assumption that this Oviraptor was on top of eggs that were not its own. So it's also a fair assumption that it was trying to steal these eggs and trying to eat them. And so because of that, for many, many decades after the fact, Oviraptor has always been depicted as being an egg-eating dinosaur. But this is not the case. Oviraptor was not an egg-thieving dinosaur. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a case of mistaken identity. See, after the discovery of Oviraptor, there was a lot more dinosaurs that were in the Oviraptorid family that were being discovered, and many of them were being found on top of eggs. But what was changing here was that many of them seemed to be in a brooding position, as in they're just laying in the center of these eggs with their arms outstretched to protect them for a multitude of different reasons. Something that modern day birds do, of course. This calls into question what the actual intentions of that first Oviraptor truly were. So, of course, further analysis was done, and it was found that, yes, these were actually its own eggs. It was not trying to steal them, it was simply trying to protect them. It was simply being a good parent. In fact, closer analysis of oviraptorids as a whole seems to indicate that they were mostly herbivorous animals. Of course, they were probably likely omnivorous too. I believe that there was a skeleton of a lizard found in the gut contents of an oviraptorid, but it seems likely that they spent most of their time eating plants. So, eggs probably weren't on the menu too frequently, therefore it was named egg thief, when in reality it probably wasn't too much of an egg thief. It was more so an egg protector more than anything. So unfortunately, even though we have many depictions of oviraptors stealing eggs, that's probably pretty far from the truth. This is a massive relative of the very famous Tyrannosaurus rex, known as Jucheng tyrannus. Jucheng tyrannus lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now China, and it seemed to be pretty large overall, with current estimations making it comparable to the size of Tarbosaurus, another large tyrannosaurid. That size being around 11 meters long and 5 metric tons in weight, which is certainly not the largest tyrannosaurid to ever exist, but it's, of course, no less impressive. Much like other tyrannosaurs, it likely had notable adaptations like a powerful bite, relatively short arms with only 2 fingers on each hand, and an overall massive build. Now, this is also a great opportunity to mention another Asian tyrannosaurid that was recently identified, known as Asia tyrannus. This fella also hailed from China, but was quite the opposite from Jucheng tyrannus, in the fact that it was significantly smaller, with a body length that is estimated to be around 4 meters, as well as being a lot more gracile, similar to other small to medium-sized tyrannosaurs like the very awesome Chanchosaurus. Though it does seem likely that this specific Asia tyrannus was not fully mature when it died, so it probably still had some growing to do. Nonetheless, it represents an interesting side of tyrannosaurs that is just as fascinating as all the massive titans that we know and love. Now, this is a very fascinating dinosaur, known as Amargasaurus. It was a sauropod that lived in the early Cretaceous of what is now Argentina, but it's quite a bit different from the sauropods that we all know and love, in a couple different ways. Firstly, it belonged to the family of Dicraeosauridae, which is a family of sauropods that were notorious for being relatively small with shorter necks. And secondly, speaking of that neck, Amargasaurus had a series of tall neurospines that of course extended from the vertebrae. These structures started on the animal's back, but were most prominent on the neck. And there was a time when these structures were believed to be essentially spikes on the animal's neck. But more recent analysis shows that they would not have been layered in keratin, rather they would have been more similar to, a couple sails on the neck, giving the animal an incredibly fascinating silhouette. Amargasaurus and Dicraeosaurids in general are just really interesting dinosaurs, and Amargasaurus is certainly a standout for a few different reasons. If you want good examples of unique raptors, then Austroraptor has to be one of the best examples. It was a dromaeosaur that lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now Argentina. It was also absolutely massive, comparable in size to Utahraptor, but it wasn't quite as big, though its length is incredibly impressive with a length of around 5 to 6 meters. They're very different from the typical raptor that we all know and love, especially compared to one like Utahraptor that was a lot more bulky and heavily built. Austroraptor, in comparison, was a lot more slim and just lightly built in general. It also had an elongated snout that were filled with very fascinating teeth. They were very fascinating because they were different from the typical raptor teeth that you find, in the fact that they're a lot more similar to spinosaurid teeth, as in they're a lot more conical and rounded. This implies that Austroraptor had a diet of fish. It might have been a piscivorous animal.
That coupled with the fact that it had relatively short arms in comparison to its body size. This implies that it mainly used its head for hunting, which again implies that it kind of dunked its head into the water to snatch up some fish. It's so incredibly fascinating that there's a raptor out there that existed like that. Of course, it was portrayed heavily in Prehistoric Planet 2, where of course, you know, there's a lot of them going after fish, and just it looks awesome. You know, the designs in that show just look absolutely beautiful, and Ostroraptor is a great one. You know, it just looks beautiful. So if I were to have a list of top 10 favorite raptors, Ostroraptor would probably be in the top 5. It's really cool. This is one of the most important dinosaurs for paleontology as a whole, at least modern day paleontology. It's known as Deinonychus, a dromaeosaur that is surprisingly not talked about too much. So Deinonychus is, as most commonly known, a raptor that lived in the early Cretaceous of what is now North America. And they are incredibly important because they helped kick off what is known as the dinosaur renaissance. Now, what is the dinosaur renaissance, I hear you asking? Maybe. Some of you might not be, but, you know, some of you might be. Well, basically, it was kind of like the switch in paleontology. For the longest time, it was believed that dinosaurs were these massive lumbering lizards that drug their tails, and they were cold-blooded animals, which is, of course, a far cry from how we see them today. So what helped change that? Well, the identification of Deinonychus anteropus and its fossils by John Ostrom. Now, John noted that these fossils were a lot more adapted for a speedier lifestyle, one that was filled with a lot more agility and just being a little bit faster than your typical cold-blooded dinosaur. So this led to the proposal that this dinosaur was warm-blooded, a lot more similar to modern-day birds, of course. He even seemingly personally thought that Deinonychus would have had feathers, but feathers were not nearly as accepted at the time. But basically what this did was kind of like recontextualize how everybody else saw dinosaurs. Now they were looking at dinosaurs in a little bit more like of a new light. The days of dinosaurs being these slow-moving dumb reptiles were long behind us. Now we were moving on to the warm-blooded, a little bit faster-moving reptiles that we see today. And this was something that was incredibly highlighted in Michael Crichton's novel known as Jurassic Park, where he emphasized the idea that dinosaurs were not slow-moving reptiles, and they were, in fact, just a lot more, you know, warm-blooded. A lot more active than what was previously assumed. And of course, it was even more emphasized when Jurassic Park the film eventually came out, which featured Velociraptor that was actually based off of Deinonychus. It all comes full circle. So the moral of the story is, Deinonychus is awesome. This is Bajadosaurus, a sauropod that lived in the early Cretaceous of what is now Argentina. Of course, they are very similar to Amargasaurus, which is a sauropod that I talked about not too long ago. And of course, they both belong to the same family, that being Dicraeosauridae. These sauropods are very well known for being relatively small. I mean, of course, they're still big, but just small in sauropod standards, which is crazy, with relatively short necks. But the way that both Amargasaurus and Bajadosaurus stand out is with their tall neural spines that extend from their neck and go down the rest of their vertebrae. Now, on Amargasaurus, they more so go straight up and to the back a little bit, but on Bajadosaurus, they point forward a little bit more, so it is still different, all things considered. But similar to Amargasaurus, these would have likely been covered up in soft tissue and would have looked a lot more similar to sail structures in life, rather than being like spikes or something like that, which is often how they are depicted. In the Amargasaurus video, I didn't really talk about the functionality of these structures, and of course, as with many outward structures, that is a matter of debate. It's possible that they could have acted as extra sort of defense to help the animal defend its neck, or they could have simply been used for display, being brightly colored in life, or, you know, just being differently colored in life, not necessarily brightly colored. Regardless, they make for very interesting looking structures and give the animal a very interesting looking silhouette. This is also a little bit of a fun fact that I want to bring up. Bajadosaurus was at the very least considered to make an appearance in Chaos Theory. It made it all the way to the concept art stage. Here it is at that kind of like gas station scene at the beginning of the season. Of course, it was later replaced by Triceratops, but imagine how cool it would be if Bajadosaurus made it like its official Jurassic franchise debut. That would be really cool. Maybe one day. Maybe one day. Meet Bambiraptor. Yep, you heard that correctly, Bambiraptor. This little fella is a dromaeosaur that lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now North America. The name literally translates to Bambi Thief. And yes, it was named after the Disney character. This was in large part due to its overall small size, that being an estimated length of around 1 meter and an estimated weight of only 2 kilograms. Of course, it still seems likely that the holotype specimen that these estimations come from was only a juvenile, which means that it still had some growing to do in life, and would have been larger once it reached its adult size. Regardless, this is still a very fascinating little raptor. For one, the brain case is pretty large in relation to its body size, implying the animal might have been relatively intelligent, though it is important to note that large head to body ratio could simply be a product of it being a juvenile. It's also noted that Bambiraptor had pretty flexible fingers and arms that could reach its mouth, meaning it could potentially hold its food up to its mouth like a squirrel or something. There's even a hypothesis that these guys were arboreal, which means they would spend a significant amount of their time in the trees. But aside from those potential possibilities, we don't know a lot about this little theropod. So hopefully with more fossil material and research, we can learn more about them in the future, because, this is it's just one of those fun dinosaurs, it's named Bambiraptor. I could also bring up that there is a possibility that this is simply just a juvenile Saurornitholestes, but that's something that's not necessarily confirmed. So as it currently stands, it is still the genus of Bambiraptor. Alright, so I've never heard of this dinosaur before, so I did some digging, and it is incredibly fascinating. It's known as Isaberysaura, which is a very fun name to say. It's known from the Middle Jurassic of what is now Argentina, and it was discovered as recent as 2017. It's also known from extremely fragmentary remains. That's something that led to some classification issues at first, but after looking at the skull, it seems to share some traits with Lager stegosaurs, so it seems likely that it was part of the Stegosauria clade. But that's pretty much as far as we know. There's still some very interesting things about this little fella, such as the analysis done on its teeth. Now, its teeth, of course, have the typical herbivorous dinosaur teeth, but it seems to have some teeth that might suggest an omnivorous diet. That's, of course, something that's not confirmed, but it is something that is possible. It's a possibility that this was an omnivorous animal. It was also discovered with stomach contents, meaning we can see the last thing that it ate. And the last thing that it ate was seeds. About 2 different types of seeds, and they seem to have been swallowed whole because there's really not any damage done on them, like it didn't chew them up or anything like that. And because we didn't find anything that's meat related, we don't really have any confirmation on whether or not it was an omnivore. But again, it's still something that's fun to think about. But of course, as you said, there's really not too much known about it, but the things that we do have about it are really fascinating, and now I definitely want to learn more about it. Also, some of the paleo art that I found that was kind of shown off up here is really cool as well. So yeah, thank you for introducing me to a brand new dinosaur. This is one of, if not the largest land animal to ever exist, known as Argentinosaurus. They lived during the late Cretaceous period of what is now, of course, Argentina. Their size is definitely no joke. Current estimations places them at about 35 meters in length, with an incredibly impressive weight of up to 80 tons, far surpassing most large land animals that we currently know to have existed. It's likely that this size was extremely beneficial for this type of animal, due to the fact that one of their neighbors was a carcharodontisaurid known as Mapusaurus, which is an animal that most likely would not have been a pushover. But one of the biggest questions out there is, how exactly could a sauropod get to be this big? Well, it seems that it all boils down to a variety of different reasons, such as the way their skeleton is structured. We have observed in many non-avian dinosaurs that they have a series of openings that run throughout their skeleton. Air sacs would have been present in these openings, and so would have made the animal lighter than it would initially appear to be. But on top of that, saving energy is also a huge issue, especially in larger animals. So what exactly is up with that? Well, the way that they could have countered that is with that long neck. Along with being a staple in sauropod dinosaurs, one of the most recognizable things about them, it also was extremely beneficial in saving energy. When you have a neck as long as that, you can essentially just stand in one place and just move your head to a wide range of different locations without moving the rest of your body, which would allow you to consume a plethora of different plant material, and as a result you'd be wasting a relatively small amount of energy. This paired with other things like faster growth rates, and you have great ingredients for absolutely massive dinosaurs that is just like unfathomable how big they got. It's crazy. This handsome son of a gun has the nickname of Elvisaurus. It's known as Cryolophosaurus. Cryolophosaurus is a theropod that lived in the early Jurassic of what is now Antarctica. That's right, Antarctica. Now, of course, this area was quite different in the early Jurassic compared to how it is now. Back then, it was certainly a lot more lush and warmer, though it was still pretty cold compared to the rest of the world at the time. And in the winters, it would have seen temperatures that were below freezing. And yet, dinosaurs still lived there. Cryolophosaurus is probably one of the most popular of these dinosaurs. It was one of the largest theropods at this time, and was likely the top predator in its given area. There is also a chance that it was feathered, especially considering it was in a cooler environment. But the claim to fame for this Jurassic meat eater is that crest. This crest is what inspired the nickname of Elvisaurus, due to the resemblance to the hairstyle often worn by the late Elvis Presley. This crest was relatively weak and delicate, so this implies that it was used mostly as a display structure, meaning it could have possibly been a different color compared to the rest of the animal's body, and could have even been a product of sexual dimorphism, meaning it could have looked different on males compared to females. The crest was also likely layered in keratin, which means it could have been larger than what the fossils suggest. This is a relatively lesser known creature, but it shows an interesting side to the non-bird dinosaurs, one that was adapted for an environment that we don't typically associate with this clade. It's by no means the only cold dinosaur in the fossil record, but it is certainly one of the most unique. Okay, I can do that. So this is Rugops. Rugops is an abelosaurid that lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now West Africa. It's unfortunately known from extremely fragmentary remains. Only pieces of the skull are really known about this animal. Of course, that makes them diagnostic enough to make them classified as an abelosaurid, because these are very much the fragmentary pieces of an abelosaurid skull. We can also gauge a rough size estimation for these guys, that being of a length of 5.3 meters and a weight of around 410 kilograms. So, of course, not too overly big, but we don't really have a lot of fossil material of the animal, so a lot of that is, of course, shaky. But because it's an abelosaurid, we can, of course, use phylogenetic bracketing to get a decent idea of the rest of its overall anatomy. It's likely that, much like other members of its family, like Carnotaurus or Majungasaurus, that it had anatomical features similar to those guys, like a very kind of like sausage-like appearance with its body, and very stubby arms that were held backwards. Abelosaurid arms are always the talking point because they're just, I mean, just look at that. I also want to note one of the coolest things about Rugops is the kind of armor that it has on the front of its snout. It had relatively thick bone that would have made it look incredibly tough when the animal was still alive. Again, not too much is known about this animal, but I might as well show off a little bit of a cool illustration of it that I have in this book. Isn't that cool? Ain't that pretty? I like it. This is Iguanodon. Iguanodon is a large herbivorous dinosaur that lived in the early Cretaceous of what is now Europe. They are very important for the field of paleontology. They were one of the first ever discovered dinosaurs and the second ever dinosaur to be named, all the way back in 1825. Almost 200 years ago. Because we've known about them so long, they've gone through a lot of different changes over the years. A lot of very interesting changes too. This is an animal that has changed drastically over time. And the reason why that happens is because the more that we know about a dinosaur, the more opportunity we have to find more fossil material. And that new fossil material that is then found fills in a lot of the gaps that we had previously. One of the most significant changes of Iguanodon was that spike. Now, when it was first discovered, in association with that spike, it was assumed and largely accepted at the time that this was simply just a nasal horn, similar to the structure that is present on the rhinoceros iguana. And because the common thought was that Iguanodon was essentially just a giant iguana, it made sense that they would think that this structure belonged on the nose. It wasn't until we found more fossil material and we were able to accurately figure out the placement of this spike that we found out that they were simply just thumb spikes. Iguanodon had huge, powerful arms that were just incredibly robust. So it stands to reason that these thumb spikes could have been used in a form of defense, as well as to tear down vegetation and make it easier for the animal to eat the food. But these thumb spikes, paired with those arms, would have been incredibly devastating to any theropod that would want to try to take on something like Iguanodon. Iguanodon is a very cool and fascinating dinosaur because it has such a, extended history. It's like one of those really fun dinosaurs to dive into. Of course, I'm sure most of us know about the famous Crystal Palace statues that represent the animal. That was a time when they were thought to be a lot more like giant iguana-like reptiles that were kind of had the form of a huge rhinoceros as well. It's just very fascinating stuff, and comparing that to something that we have today, these reconstructions, it's just very, very interesting. Great question. The first ever officially named dinosaur was Megalosaurus. It was named all the way back in 1824, which, as of 2024, is 200 years ago, which is absolutely insane. Unfortunately, it's a theropod dinosaur that we don't know too much about. It's known from still very fragmentary remains, which is really unfortunate. But it is still incredibly important, mainly because it was given a name. Because we officially identified this as its own genus of animal, that kind of got the ball rolling, and really started to establish paleontology as its own thing. It was really the recognition period for long extinct animals. It was the acknowledgement that this was an animal that once lived and died here, which of course is absolutely huge and leads to what we have today with over 1,000 identified species of dinosaurs. The name Megalosaurus is also incredibly telling. It translates to great lizard, and that pretty much solidifies how they viewed these extinct animals at the time. At the time, it was assumed that Megalosaurus was a giant lizard-like reptile, and so of course it would be given the name Megalosaurus, which translates to something like that. Even the Crystal Palace reconstructions, these giant statues represent that quite well. At the time, Megalosaurus was pretty much shown off as a giant crocodile rhino lizard creature, which is very different from how it is portrayed today, which of course we now know it's a theropod dinosaur, so we know it would have been bipedal instead of quadrupedal. It would have also been smaller than how the Crystal Palace reconstructions portrayed them, and just a different overall skull shape. It also wouldn't drag its tail, of course. But yeah, again, Megalosaurus is very important for the field of paleontology, and so because of that, it is a very cool non-avian dinosaur. Day 67 of asking for a video on Baryonyx. That's a lot of days. Let's talk about Baryonyx. Now, Baryonyx is a Spinosaurid that lived in the early Cretaceous of what is now Europe. Of course, them being a Spinosaurid means that they have a lot of adaptations that we're used to seeing in this family of dinosaurs, such as an elongated snout that is filled with relatively straight and conical teeth, high raised nostrils, decently long arms with 3 massive claws, the thumb claw in particular being really huge, and an overall knack for eating fish. Of course, all of these adaptations do really make hunting fish pretty easy. And hold on to that thought, Baryonyx is really important because of that reason. See, it was the first ever dinosaur that was found with direct evidence of eating fish, because we found fish scales in its belly. The stomach contents of Baryonyx did reveal that it had a piscivorous diet, which pretty much confirms that those adaptations were best suited for something like that. But what's also really cool is that it seems it didn't just eat fish, because small iguanodon fossils have been found in the stomach contents as well. Seemingly from a juvenile iguanodon, of course. Now, of course, we don't know if it actually hunted the iguanodon or if it simply scavenged from it, but we do know that this type of animal was on the menu from time to time. But yeah, Baryonyx is probably one of the most important dinosaurs of that family. It kind of filled in a lot of the gaps that we had for other Spinosaurids, such as Spinosaurus itself, and so it certainly earns its seat at the table. This is the largest non-sauropod dinosaur that we know of. The hadrosaur known as Shantungosaurus. Shantungosaurus lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now China, and they were enormous. Current size estimations have them sitting at 15 to 17 meters in length and a staggering 13 to 16 metric tons in weight. It was certainly larger than any other ornithischian dinosaur that we know of, and definitely larger than pretty much any theropod that we know of, including the iconic Tyrannosaurus rex. They are probably one of the most shining examples of hadrosaurs likely not being pushovers, because these guys were most likely not an easy meal at all, unless of course they were young. They had a lot of the same traits that we often see with hadrosaurs, such as the longer snout with a beak at the end, and a mouthful of about 1,500 teeth that were perfect for grinding up plant material. Absolutely love hadrosaurs, and I think that Shantungosaurus is certainly one that probably does need to be talked about a little bit more. Of course, it's not necessarily one that we know too much about, but still, it's a very, very fascinating dinosaur nonetheless. Alrighty, let's talk a little bit about Carnotaurus. Now, Carnotaurus is a theropod dinosaur that belongs to the Abelosaurid family. It lived during the late Cretaceous of what is now South America. They are probably one of the most recognizable theropod dinosaurs out there because they have very interesting, unique features about them. They have a very deep skull with a mouth that is filled with razor-sharp teeth, of course, 2 horns that are situated basically right above the eyes, and very small arms that are significantly smaller than the arms of Tyrannosaurus rex. But what I find most fascinating about Carnotaurus is that it was likely among the fastest of the non-avian dinosaurs. See, its tail offers a lot of insight about that. See, looking at some of the tail vertebrae reveals that they had structures that went to the top and off to the side. These would have allowed extra room for muscles, and the vertebrae in particular that had these extra muscles were used in helping the animal stride. This implies that it had these incredibly powerful bursts of speed and was likely pretty fast overall. It seems pretty likely that most of us would not have been able to outrun Carnotaurus, which would have made it a very dangerous dinosaur indeed. Carnotaurus is a dinosaur that's gaining a little bit more popularity in recent years, which I think is absolutely awesome. And so to celebrate, I'm going to end it off with, of course, everybody's favorite dancing Carnotaurus clip from Prehistoric Planet. There you go. This is the largest dinosaur with direct fossil evidence of having feathers, known as Utyrannus. Utyrannus lived in the early Cretaceous of what is now China. They were a tyrannosauroid, which means that they belong to the same superfamily as Tyrannosaurus rex. Not quite in the same family, but still decently closely related. And as I mentioned, they are the largest dinosaur with direct fossil evidence of having feathers. Now I know what some of you are probably thinking and getting ready to type. Didn't Dinosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex have feathers? It is highly suspected that those dinosaurs did have feathers, plus many other large theropods, but the only thing is that we haven't found any direct fossil evidence for that being present. Utyrannus, we have found direct fossil evidence for it. But again, it is still likely that Dinosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex had feathers too. Utyrannus has a lot of really interesting anatomical features. It is relatively thin and slender in its overall build. It had these relatively long arms with 3 digits on each hand and a pretty slim snout filled with, of course, a lot of teeth. They also have a nasal ridge on the nasal portion of their skull and these little lacrimal horns that jut out right before the eyes, giving them a very interesting silhouette, if you ask me. These structures were likely used primarily for display and could have possibly been a different color in life, but of course that's something that we don't necessarily know. They were completely feathered with these type of downy feathers, and so again, would have just looked really interesting in life. It makes sense that they were completely feathered as well because the environment in which they lived was relatively cold, especially during the winter months, so they certainly would have gotten a lot of advantages from having full feathering. And all in all, they were a very important fossil discovery. They really pushed the limits of what we thought was possible for dinosaurs in the way that they kind of recontextualized how big dinosaurs could possibly be and still have full feathering. Until the discovery of Utyrannus, the largest dinosaur with confirmed feathers was Baryonyx, this little therizzinosauroid here. I say little, but it was still pretty big, but not as big as Utyrannus. Utyrannus rolled around and showed us that dinosaurs could possibly get bigger and still have full feathers. Just very awesome and fascinating stuff. Sinosauropteryx is a very cool little dinosaur, and one of the biggest reasons why that is because it's one of the few dinosaurs that we actually have a pretty good idea of what color it was. And that is because the animal was so well preserved that you can still see these little structures known as melanosomes. Melanosomes are something that help determine the animal's color. And so when you take those melanosomes and you compare them to the ones found in modern day birds, you get the coloration that the animal had in life. So at the very least, this specific individual of Sinosauropteryx looked like this. A sort of orange coloration with some blacks and some whites and even like a ringed tail. Sort of like a lemur. It is, of course, very adorable and just very amazing because, of course, we don't know the colors of a lot of different dinosaurs. Most of them, actually. There's only a small fraction of dinosaurs that we actually have a good idea of what colors they were when they were alive. And it always amazes me that that's something that we are able to determine. That's one of the biggest reasons why paleontology is so fascinating to me. It has been a while since I talked about Sinosauropteryx. Of course, I think I've talked about it a couple of times, mainly because it's one of the few dinosaurs that we know the colors of, but yeah, no, it's always fun to talk about that little theropod. I absolutely love it. This is likely one of the most recognizable dinosaurs out there, known as Triceratops. Triceratops is a ceratopsian dinosaur that lived during the late Cretaceous of what is now North America. They were among the last of the non-avian dinosaurs, going extinct at the very end of the Cretaceous period alongside Tyrannosaurus rex, meaning that they're technically one of the most recent non-avian dinosaurs in the fossil record. They were big dinosaurs, with a weight that could likely reach up to 10 tons. Of course, being that large would likely be incredibly beneficial for them, because again, their neighbor and likely rival was Tyrannosaurus rex, a dinosaur that did have Triceratops on the menu, as we can see through some bite marks on Triceratops fossils. Paired with its massive size, Triceratops also does translate to three-horned face, named as such because there are 3 horns on its face, 2 incredibly long brow horns, and 1 significantly short nasal horn. They also have this really awesome looking structure known as a frill that was likely mostly used as display as well as just a way for them to identify members of the same species. And one fun fact I like to talk about with Triceratops is its discovery. When it was first found, it was discovered from those brow horns, and it was assumed that this was an extinct species of bison because the horned dinosaurs had not been discovered yet. They didn't know that there were dinosaurs that were quite like this. It wasn't until later fossil discoveries were made that it was found out that this animal in question was actually a giant reptile and belonged to the Dinosauria clade. Just a little fun fact right there. This little guy is known as Lielanosaura. Liaonosaura was an ornithopod that lived during the early Cretaceous of what is now Australia. They lived at a time when Australia was connected to Antarctica, and when Australia existed within the Antarctic Circle, which means that Australia was relatively cold during the time of the early Cretaceous, especially during the winters. Because of this fact, it's likely that Liaonosaura had feathers. Feathers that were properly designed for insulating to help keep the animal warm, especially during those colder periods. Along with those feathers, one of the most striking things about it is potentially its tail. See, at some point, an extremely long and thin tail has been found. Now, initially that fossil tail was assigned to Liaonosaura, and this tail gave the animal a length of about 3 feet, most of that length coming from the tail alone, which is just absolutely insane and gives it a very interesting silhouette and just a unique look about it. Unfortunately, though, the idea on whether or not this is the tail of the animal has been called into question. There are many who believe that the fossil material doesn't necessarily match up with the other fossil material that we have of the animal. So right now it's kind of like a debated topic on whether or not Liaonosaura did have a tail like this. But if it did, one of the proposed ideas on how this tail was used was that it possibly could have used it to wrap around itself while it's sleeping or something like that and keep itself warm during those colder nights, which of course is just incredibly adorable. All around, very cool dinosaurs. Pun intended. It has been a while since I've talked about one of my all-time favorite dinosaurs, that being Pachyrhinosaurus. Pachyrhinosaurus was a ceratopsian that lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now North America. The place in which it lived was relatively cold compared to the rest of the world at the time, especially during the winters. That is why you will often see Pachyrhinosaurus depicted in a kind of cooler environment, especially with snow. Makes for some really cool imagery because people don't often think of dinosaurs being in a snowy environment, but it very much did happen. It had a fairly typical ceratopsian build with a very bulky body and a relatively short tail, but of course the skull is where it mostly stands out. Much like other ceratopsians, its skull was covered with all kinds of different ornamentation. Most ceratopsians do have horns or spikes all over the place, and while Pachyrhinosaurus did have its fair share of spikes and small horns, depending on the species of course, what it's most known for is that massive bone that is situated right on its nose. This is known as a boss, and it's a structure that was likely layered in keratin in life and, could have had a multitude of different functions, ranging from a defensive weapon to something that helps identify members of the same species. All around, it's a very unique structure and makes Pachyrhinosaurus stand out amongst the crowd. Just truly a very awesome dinosaur. Great question. The first ever officially named dinosaur was Megalosaurus. It was named all the way back in 1824, which, as of 2024, is 200 years ago, which is absolutely insane. Unfortunately, it's a theropod dinosaur that we don't know too much about. It's known from still very fragmentary remains, which is really unfortunate. But it is still incredibly important, mainly because it was given a name. Because we officially identified this as its own genus of animal, that kind of got the ball rolling and really started to establish paleontology as its own thing. It was really the recognition period for long extinct animals. It was the acknowledgement that this was an animal that once lived and died here, which of course is absolutely huge and leads to what we have today with over 1,000 identified species of dinosaurs. The name Megalosaurus is also incredibly telling. It translates to great lizard, and that pretty much solidifies how they viewed these extinct animals at the time. At the time, it was assumed that Megalosaurus was a giant lizard-like reptile, and so of course it would be given the name Megalosaurus, which translates to something like that. Even the Crystal Palace reconstructions, these giant statues represent that quite well. At the time, Megalosaurus was pretty much shown off as a giant crocodile rhino lizard creature, which is very different from how it is portrayed today, which of course we now know it's a theropod dinosaur, so we know it would have been bipedal instead of quadrupedal. It would have also been smaller than how the Crystal Palace reconstructions portrayed them, and just a different overall skull shape. It also wouldn't drag its tail, of course. But yeah, again, Megalosaurus is very important for the field of paleontology, and so because of that, it is a very cool non-avian dinosaur. Happy New Year! I figured we could start 2025 off right with some T.rex facts. Firstly, did you know that T.rex is the largest land predator to ever walk the earth? That we know of course. In biology, when determining which animal is larger, you would go off of mass, not volume. And while Spinosaurus and Giganotosaurus may have been longer and or taller than the Rex, they were not heavier. Next, T-Rex had incredible vision. Examination of the brain case showed that the optic lobe, which is the seeing part of the brain, was incredibly developed, meaning it had a great sense of sight, rivaling the sight of modern-day birds of prey, paired with forward-facing eyes that allowed for depth perception, and you had a dinosaur that could see very, very well. Next, T-Rex had a bone-crushing bite. Analysis of T-Rex bite marks on other Hell Creek dinosaurs revealed that this animal had no problem delivering a devastating blow with its teeth. It is estimated that the Rex had the most powerful bite force of any completely terrestrial animal to ever exist. And finally, no, T-Rex did not evolve into the chicken. They are simply related. Day 67 of asking for a video on Baryonyx. That's a lot of days. Let's talk about Baryonyx. Now, Baryonyx is a Spinosaurid that lived in the early Cretaceous of what is now Europe. Of course, them being a Spinosaurid means that they have a lot of adaptations that we're used to seeing in this family of dinosaurs, such as an elongated snout that is filled with relatively straight and conical teeth, high raised nostrils, decently long arms with 3 massive claws, the thumb claw in particular being really huge, and an overall knack for eating fish. Of course, all of these adaptations do really make hunting fish pretty easy. And hold on to that thought, Baryonyx is really important because of that reason. See, it was the first ever dinosaur that was found with direct evidence of eating fish, because we found fish scales in its belly. The stomach contents of Baryonyx did reveal that it had a piscivorous diet, which pretty much confirms that those adaptations were best suited for something like that. But what's also really cool is that it seems it didn't just eat fish, because small iguanodon fossils have been found in the stomach contents as well. Seemingly from a juvenile iguanodon, of course. Now, of course, we don't know if it actually hunted the iguanodon or if it simply scavenged from it, but we do know that this type of animal was on the menu from time to time. But yeah, Baryonyx is probably one of the most important dinosaurs of that family. It kind of filled in a lot of the gaps that we had for other Spinosaurids, such as Spinosaurus itself, and so it certainly earns its seat at the table. Alrighty, let's talk a little bit about Carnotaurus. Now, Carnotaurus is a theropod dinosaur that belongs to the Abelosaurid family. It lived during the late Cretaceous of what is now South America. They are probably one of the most recognizable theropod dinosaurs out there because they have very interesting, unique features about them. They have a very deep skull with a mouth that is filled with razor-sharp teeth, of course, 2 horns that are situated basically right above the eyes, and very small arms that are significantly smaller than the arms of Tyrannosaurus rex. But what I find most fascinating about Carnotaurus is that it was likely among the fastest of the non-avian dinosaurs. See, its tail offers a lot of insight about that. See, looking at some of the tail vertebrae reveals that they had structures that went to the top and off to the side. These would have allowed extra room for muscles, and the vertebrae in particular that had these extra muscles were used in helping the animal stride. This implies that it had these incredibly powerful bursts of speed and was likely pretty fast overall. It seems pretty likely that most of us would not have been able to outrun Carnotaurus, which would have made it a very dangerous dinosaur indeed. Carnotaurus is a dinosaur that's gaining a little bit more popularity in recent years, which I think is absolutely awesome. And so to celebrate, I'm going to end it off with, of course, everybody's favorite dancing Carnotaurus clip from Prehistoric Planet. There you go.